Okay. So we didn't get through all the slides completely last week, and so the title of the lecture last week was about statistics, prediction, and reproducibility. And so what we're going to cover now is sort of the remainder of the slides from last week quickly, and then the dynamic experiment slides after the break. We'll try to do this a little bit quicker than the pace we went last time. And again, all these slides are available, so if you want to spend more time on anything in particular, it's there. This slide I find quite helpful as sort of a starting point, and so it's taken from sort of the scikit-learn community. You can find the original image there. And it's sort of how do you get started with a problem when you're trying to analyze your data. And of course, this is very, very generic. This isn't necessarily applicable to exactly the problems you're working with, but it's a very helpful starting point. And so when you have a problem, sort of your beginning is if you have more than 50 samples or not. And if you don't, then you should get more samples. Otherwise, using machine learning and model generation is probably not going to work very well. And then kind of what is your challenge? You know, are you trying to put things into different categories? So classification, you know, say this sample belongs to group A and this one belongs to group B, or this one's healthy, this one's sick. And of course, if that's the case, then do you have some labeled data? So do you already know what the groups are? And then sort of what approaches do you have, you know, if they're labeled, what approaches do you have if they're not labeled? And as you see, k-means shows up here as one of the tools that you can use for analyzing your data, as well as some other approaches. And so we won't, of course, be able to cover all the different topics that are listed here, but it gives you sort of a rough idea of what you could possibly do. And so, you know, for example, if you're not looking to categorize it, you're looking to quantify it, then you have this whole set of regression tools available. If you're not trying to quantify it and you're just looking or sort of doing some exploratory analysis, trying to see how your data is organized, then there's sort of another set of tools that are available. And so here, PCA, like we had with the shape tensor comes in, and there's a number of other approaches that you can also look at. And so basically what this comes into is the sort of main categories of things that we try to do with the data when we're making predictions or doing these sort of further analyses. And so the first one is classification, so taking things and putting them into different groups. The next broad category is regression, and that's trying to predict a number or a continuous variable from an image that you're looking at. And so, you know, with both classification and regression, if you have a task like segmentation, so identifying, you know, where the faces are in the image, that would fall into sort of a classification problem. But instead of trying to classify images, you're classifying pixels. Clustering is then sort of when you're grouping things together, but the categories themselves aren't important. You're interested in different things being in different groups. Yeah.
What's the difference between classification and clustering?
Yeah, so classification is when you have, I mean, they're very similar. And so if we look at this chart, sort of the very basic one is you're trying to put it into a category, but they're not necessarily labeled categories. And so what that means sort of concretely is that, you know, if you want to divide the students in a class into 3 different groups, where, you know, each of the groups has different strengths and is good at different areas, that would be kind of a clustering problem. You're trying to group it together. Superpixels is also a clustering problem. You're trying to group pixels that are similar together. And you're not necessarily trying to make sure that the groups are exactly the same every time, or that everything in group 1 the first time you run the analysis is in group 1 the second time you run the analysis. So when we look at something like a classification task, normally the way you assess it is with a misclassification rate. So like with this ROC curve, so if I say that you have cancer and you don't have cancer, that's wrong. And with a clustering, you try to say, I want the difference between my two groups to be as big as possible. And so rather than saying I want healthy and cancer patients, I just want two groups that are as separable as possible, which means that sort of they're more homogeneous inside, and the difference between them is as large as possible. And so they have kind of different tasks. Another example of this would be sort of if you were making like insurance policies for life insurance. You could say we're going to try to categorize everyone, and we'll try to put them in a labeled category. And so that would be a classification problem, where you try to say there's people who do extreme sports. We'll ask them if they ski, if they like to go base jumping or something like that in the little survey, and then we'll put them in a category of extreme sport people. You could then have an approach where you say it's very difficult to figure out if they're actually an extreme sport athlete or not, but what we can do is we can cluster them with similar people, and then we make a model and a rate for each cluster that we generate. And so clustering is sort of much less supervised, more I want to divide the groups up, and I'm not exactly sure where those decision boundaries should be. But I know if I can make a group that's very similar, it'll be much easier for me to handle that group later. The final step in this category is really the dimensionality reduction. So there's a lot of different tools available there as well. And this is where you try to explain a large amount of the variation in your system using a small number of variables. And so sort of with images, for example, you might have 10,000 pixels in your image, and you don't necessarily want to look at each pixel individually because that's kind of hard to look at. It's also hard to compare a pixel between a lot of different examples. And so when you use an approach for dimensionality reduction, you can find sort of important factors which explain most of the differences in your image, and then analyze just those factors. And so you can sort of get the things that are all very strongly correlated grouped together and analyze those. And so this is where you have things like principal component analysis, these kernel approximations, and some of these other approaches. Probably won't be things we get into too much detail in this course. They're just important to be kind of generally aware so that when you get a new problem, you have an idea of how you can approach it. What's also very nice about this specific cheat sheet is this then maps very well to the tools that are available for you in packages like Python scikit-learn and KNIME's data mining toolbox and R all have all of these functions inside of them. So once you decide on a method, it's then very easy to figure out which tools you need to apply and what the right approach would be. And so basically all of these tools or all of these approaches map inputs to outputs. And so the input could be an image, a point, a feature vector, some sort of multi-dimensional tensor like a shape tensor that we're putting inside there. And then the output is, if it's a continuous value, it would be a regression. If it's a category or a group, it would be a classification. A group would be then a clustering. A vector matrix tensor with sort of fewer degrees than the input would be a dimensionality reduction. And so one of the very important topics whenever we're talking about something like prediction is this idea of overfitting. So has anyone heard of overfitting before? No one? Okay. Well, this is one of the core concepts that you need to be aware of, particularly as you start to use more and more complicated machine learning models. particularly tools like deep learning and random forests, are very, very prone to overfitting because they're able to automatically generate such complicated models. You can get a model that is very, very accurate or appears to be very, very accurate, but is in fact, fitting the very small noise differences in your data. And so one of the simplest ways to understand this is using sort of this magic classifier. This is a hash map in Java or a dictionary in Python, where you basically train the data on, dog is an animal, Bob is a person, fish is an animal. So let's say this is your training data. Your goal is to take a name of something and assign what category it belongs to. And so now, if you try this magic classifier, you can then see magic classifier for dog is animal, magic classifier for Bob is person, magic classifier for fish is animal. And so we get 3 of 3. So our accuracy on this data set is 100%.
That's just the values we set ourselves.
Right. And that's exactly what sort of overfitting is that we make something. I mean, in this example, it's very simple. In other examples, it's much harder to see. But we basically make something that spits out the training data again. And because our training data is too similar, in this case, exactly the same as the data we test the model with, it appears that our model works perfectly. I mean, it would be very, very complicated to make a model that actually understood the characters and could put things into different categories that worked as well as this classifier here. And so the whole idea of overfitting is that your model is spitting out more or less exactly what you've put into it. And because the way you're checking your model is not very robust, you're convinced your model works well. And so this example is sort of overly simplistic, but it's sort of to give you the idea that when you're checking your model, you need to make sure you're not checking it with the exact same things you trained it with. Because even the most simplest model, if you check it with what you trained it with, you'll get 100% accuracy. Without having understood what a dog is, what a Bob is, what a fish is, it just memorized that you've shown that before, and it doesn't work. And so if we now try it on new data with this model, we get an exception. So if you try to figure out what an octopus is, it won't spit anything out because it's never seen an octopus before, and so it has no predictive ability. And so really when we're making models for these kinds of systems, our interest isn't that it can reproduce the training data. Our interest is that it has the ability to predict something on data it hasn't seen before. Which, sort of when you apply this to the image analysis approaches that we do, the reason that a threshold is useful for us is because you can take an image as an input and predict pretty accurately, if your threshold works well, what belongs to different phases in your image. If your threshold is everything that's below 0 in a CT image, that will spit out lung or tissue very accurately. And so it's able to predict based on an input where the tissue or soft tissue is in your image. And that's a very simple model, but it works fairly well. And so this would be a very, very bad model, but if you validate it with just the data that you trained it with, it appears to have worked very well. And so these ideas that are very important to sort of understand is this idea of kind of validation. And so we won't cover this again in very much detail. It's just important to be aware that sort of when you make a new tool or when you make a new analysis, it's important that you have your data that you're working with divided into kind of different groups. And so the first thing is you have your training data set. And this is the data set that you're using to actually build and tweak your model. The next is sort of the validation data set, and that's to make sure that your model works on data that you haven't explicitly trained it on. And then the final is kind of this testing data set. And this is a very small group of data that you then only look at once at the very end. And so even when you're not using something like deep learning or random forests or these sort of approaches, this validation approach can be very helpful. So that when you're analyzing normal images and you're going through them and you're doing Gaussian filters and applying thresholds and doing component labeling and measuring, anisotropy, you can apply this, and you should apply this initially on a training data set where you adjust the parameters, you adjust the thresholds, you adjust the width, everything else of your system to show that it works well. And then you want to take a different set of data where you're not adjusting the parameters anymore and you know that it worked well in your training set to test out that model that you've built to show that it works on data that you didn't explicitly optimize it yourself to work on. And then this testing set is sort of what, once you've decided your model works well enough in this validation step, what you use to actually show your model really works. And so these two can be kind of a little bit confusing, and the problem is that as you build models, it's very, very easy, particularly with more complicated machine learning tools, to make a model that works really, really well on your training data set. This is actually trivial. I mean, it requires, for some problems, a bit more effort, but making something that gives you a reasonable result on data you've trained it on is not a challenging problem, and it's not what makes machine learning interesting. Kind of the more challenging problem is how does it work on data that you haven't shown it before. But when you're training, you make something and you want to test it. You then apply that to the validation data set and you get some results. And then you see, okay, it didn't work very well. Maybe the threshold was wrong. Maybe the Gaussian was wrong. You go back, adjust your model on the training data set, and then reapply it to the validation. And the problem with that is that when you start iteratively validating on the validation data set, that you're effectively kind of making the validation part of your training data set. So you'll be changing the parameters in your system to make it work well on the validation as well. And so what you need to really have is a set of data that's completely set aside, where you say, I will assess how well the algorithm works based on just this data set, and I won't have the opportunity to tweak any parameters until everything here, or I won't have an opportunity to tweak the parameters after I've analyzed this data set. So I'll only analyze it once. This is also sort of the contest approach that you have on Kaggle. So you get a training data set, you get a little bit of validation as far as when you upload your model, you get a result on how accurate you were on a portion of the data on sort of the leaderboard. And then when the competition ends, the ranks are updated based on this testing result, which you've never seen before, and no one has sort of the answer to, and that will be your final ranking. And so actually these ideas fit very well with sort of the contest approach. And this is kind of the best ways we have of knowing that you made something that actually has some predictive power. And so it's really important that you have these separate categories, even if you're not necessarily dealing with labeled data or really big, large-scale problems, just so that you know your system works reliably enough. And particularly when you're dealing with sort of experimental data, it's very helpful when your training data covers a large number of different groups, but you have a testing data set that's measured sort of on a different day with slightly different settings or slightly different samples or something like that, so that you can actually be confident this approach you developed is in fact robust and can be used for other people to predict or extract the values that you're interested in. Is that clear? Because this is quite an important idea to be comfortable with. And it's something you've probably done intuitively before, but with sort of more complicated analysis approaches that are available, it's very important that you do it correctly, because a lot of times it's not immediately obvious that you haven't done all of this correctly, but when someone else tries to reproduce your experiment, they won't get very good results, because in fact, your tool was just optimized to do really well on your small set of data. It wasn't optimized to solve a general problem very well. So that, yeah, we have a concrete example of trying to classify flowers. And so this was the data set we briefly covered before, where you have all of this different information available. Ultimately, your goal is to put these flowers into different groups. You sort of want to divide the data up. So in this case, we'll take 60% of it is for training. 10% of it is for validation. Sorry, 60% for training, 30% for validation, and 10% for testing. And sort of an R, you can do this with this fairly simple loop. And that basically each one of these data points gets assigned to one of these different groups. And so now we can show sort of our testing data set is here, our training data set is there, and our validation data set is here. And so kind of what the goal would be is to correctly decide which group a point belongs in based on sort of the sepal length and the sepal width. So we want to come up with a model that sort of is able to predict which group something falls in by knowing that information. And so what we can use here is a very simple decision tree. And so we won't really talk about how a decision tree works, but it's a nice way, it's a nice, very simple model that you can use to classify and give you something that's fairly easy to understand. And so we're able to put this data in. We just take the subset of it that's marked training, and we use the rpart function to make a decision tree. And so what we have here is then a tree, and it basically says if the sepal length is less than 5.5, then we go down this branch. If it's greater than 5.5, we go down this branch. If the sepal width is greater than 2.8, it's setosa. If the sepal width is less than 2.8, it's versicolor. And so we get kind of this list of rules that we can apply. You can also print it out as an actual list, where you then have sort of what the categories are and what the probabilities are at the end of being each category. You can then make very easily a map of where the model predicts, and so that's this transparent background color, and then where the points actually fall. And so we can use the validation data here to show kind of where that model was accurate and where it wasn't accurate. And so we see that model is fairly simple. I mean, you have that kind of jagged boundary, but everything else is fairly trivial. And all of these large points are the points that were not classified incorrectly. And so it got the setosa very accurately, but it had some problems with sort of this versicolor, which, from our visual perspective, it would be difficult to classify correctly, because using these two parameters, there is quite a bit of overlap. And so if we then put the test data on it, we could then show the test points at the very end. And normally we would have iterated, we would have tried different trees, we would have tried including different variables, maybe some transformations, other steps. There's lots and lots of tools available for trying to make better models. And once we've decided that it's the best model, we can evaluate how well our model works by looking at actually this testing set, where we can then show where all the points fall and have some sort of result there. Another example that's slightly more difficult is sort of a spiral example, where we sort of have X and Y, and then we have a class that it belongs to. And so if we show the graphical representation of this data, it's very simple. I mean, you can easily see sort of the structure in this data, that there's sort of two spirals. One spiral belongs to the category happy. The other spiral belongs to the category sad. Deciding a point here might be very difficult, but everything else is fairly straightforward. And this is a very helpful example to look at because particularly with machine learning or all the image analysis approaches that we've had, this problem is very challenging. And so, if you think about the image processing tools that we've used, like a threshold would struggle a lot with this because there isn't a point or a line you can draw here that divides the categories well. And so we can divide the data then into three different groups where we sort of have our training data, validation data, and a testing data set. We can then try to use a decision tree. So what kind of rules could we have for assigning, happy and sad categories? Create a list of rules from this tree, and then we can show what our tree learned. And so, you can very instantly see that our tree did not learn the right model or representation for the data because it has to draw vertical or horizontal lines, and it now draws them, and it comes up with some classification that works maybe some of the time, but there's going to be a lot of points where this really does not work very well. And then if you show sort of the testing data set, you see that it gets a huge number of these testing points wrong as well because it fundamentally didn't understand the structure of the data. So we can try making a more complicated tree. So instead of just feeding linear variables in, you can feed in sort of transformed variables where you have x squared, the sine of x, a number of other parameters, where you can then start to get kind of more interesting, complicated structures, but that still doesn't cover sort of the actual representation of the data. And so you have a much more complicated model. I mean, when you look at these transparent background things, it's incorporated a lot of different features inside it, but it hasn't necessarily done much better of a job of trying to assess what is actually important in the data. And so for those of you interested, there's something called TensorFlow Playground. Where you can take this spiral data set exactly as it is, and you can sort of graphically make a neural network that tries to learn this representation. And so you can take sort of this spiral, you have the data, you can sort of select what the ratio of training and test data are, how many neurons you have, how many different layers you have, and you can sort of visually watch as the model tries to learn a reasonable representation of the data. And as you see, it's a slightly more complicated structure than we have before, but with two hidden layers in a neural network, you don't really have much of a chance of understanding that structure. And so what you can do is you can add, a number of hidden layers, which can then start to extract some of the more complicated features because you're not limited to simple sort of linear features. So you can start to get more interesting features, particularly if you're patient. And what you see here is sort of the accuracy on your training data and the accuracy on your testing data. So you see the model does much better on the training than on the testing, which is a sign that it's overfitting. And so until it gets significantly better or closer, you have a model that's probably massively overfitting your data, but you can see that sort of as you put more and more data in it and you train it longer and longer, it does get better at representing some of these more complicated features in your data set. And so the goal isn't really to understand how all of these neural networks work. It's to understand this approach and this kind of visualization for what are you actually looking at and how do you know if a complicated model is working well or not. And this approach just happens to be very nice because it's very visual with the data sets that we have. Normal data sets that we're looking at, if you have a whole image, there's thousands, if not millions, of different coordinates there, and so it'll be very difficult for you to visually see where those divisions are.
It's basically trying to reproduce the image.
Yeah, so it's trying to reproduce these categorizations. So it's trying to come up with a rule so that when you give it a new point, it can decide if it's blue or orange, which is what you're kind of always trying to do with predictions or with making models, that you're able to accurately take sort of some new piece of information and categorize it well. And so you can see it's starting to sort of get the structure out of the data. I mean, this is why neural networks are so useful, because they are able to learn very, very complicated things with enough data and with enough training time. But, for us, this is very trivial to see how that's organized. And for the network, it is a very complicated task to try to come up with a bunch of linear components which are able to represent this well.
It still doesn't look like.
No, it doesn't look like it very well. I think it takes probably too long. I think we can try adding some more components there. Unfortunately, it's in the web browser, so you can't make it go much faster. And so here you can see it starting to actually learn that pattern. And so by giving it the right combination of features and the right rough topology, it's sort of able to come up with this, rough structure for actually fitting the data. But if you don't give it the right features, or you have the wrong number of hidden layers, or the wrong training function, or the wrong set of weights that you're putting into it, you won't necessarily get a very reasonable result out of your data.
But I have to try all the combinations. Like you don't know a priori.
Right, you don't.
You still just try.
More or less, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there are some strategies for doing this better, but the most important things you need to have for something like this is this training, this test, this validation approach, so that you can be sure if you've built a model that it's actually doing what you want to do. And that's actually one of the most important reasons to have these groups separated and this label data available, because if you try, this is a very simple problem with only really two variables that you're trying to classify into two groups. Most of the scientific problems you have are much more complicated than that. And it's already a large number of parameters you have to potentially optimize. To go through the number of hidden layers, to go through the features, to go through what your batch size should be, how much training and test data, all of that is quite time consuming. And so what you want to have, and what you always have when you're training neural networks, is the ability to kind of run a lot of different experiments in parallel and have a very easily defined quantitative criteria for which models work the best. Because if you just click around here, you might find a model that works really well, but it will take you an incredibly long time. And so if you can come up with something like this test laws, then you can try thousands of different models or millions of different models and have a very easy way of saying this model is the best one because the score is the highest. Yeah.
But why are you trying to fit it to these functions like x squared and this saddle function and the sinus? You see the structure of reminds of the spiral.
Yeah.
You can take the initial function to be something spiral-like.
Yeah, you can. But we can see the spiral here very easily. If this were a 1,000 variable data set in a 1,000 variable space, it would be very difficult for you to see that spiral. And if you're dealing with, a normal imaging data set or a normal data set that you collect from, 2 different machines, it's going to be difficult for you to know that that's supposed to be a spiral. So of course, if you generate the data yourself with a piece of code, to make a model that's able to predict what category everything goes in is very easy. The part of this that's interesting is that you can use sort of very standard simple components in order to predict a complicated structure from your data. And so it's not impressive that it's able to sort of match a spiral. It's impressive that it's able to learn how to make a spiral from very simple components. Because even for you, I think it would take a little while for you to write down the function for that spiral. You'd have to somehow measure what's the radius, how fast is that radius getting bigger, is it always constant in this region? And that's not a very simple problem to do. And this is just in 2-dimensional space. And so when you're in a much larger dimensional space, to try to do the same thing would be almost impossible.
I will start working in polar coordinates, for example, and not in Cartesian. So.
Yeah, but I mean, this is, if you're dealing with a 1,000-dimensional space, what is polar coordinates? R is fairly easy, but then you have phi, theta, and you run out of Greek letters very quickly to represent what angles you're looking at in a polar coordinate space. And as we see here, R isn't necessarily always decisive because these two R's are the same. So there, theta is important for deciding which category it goes in. For this problem in particular, using a polar coordinate system would probably work better. But for other problems, using polar coordinates wouldn't necessarily work well. And so the spiral is just an example case of a more difficult problem. That if we give it a problem like this is pretty trivial. We don't find it very impressive that a neural network can learn to separate those 2 groups. K-means would separate those 2 groups. Well, K-means wouldn't, but a slight modification of K-means would separate that fairly well. Or this sort of problem. This is very, this would be sort of 2 thresholds that you have. A tree, a very simple set of rules would actually classify that for us. But to learn sort of a spiral or a more complicated structure is a much more difficult task. And that's what makes it more impressive that this is able to actually learn that model from what we have. So I think we'll skip the parameter aspects now. This fits into sort of the ideas that we covered before, that when you have lots of different models, when you're in this playground, you have different things with layers and features and data, which is what you have kind of everywhere. With the image processing problems, you don't necessarily have the idea of layers here. You have sort of your filters, edge enhancements, morphology operations that you can add and remove as you want. You want to have a way of deciding which combination of these produces the best result and is best able to measure what you're actually interested in. And so this is where we use this kind of validation approach to look at our entire model and decide which ones work well and which ones don't work well. Qualitative assessment is sort of always important, particularly when you're looking at image data. You want to have some idea, does the output your tool is making sort of make sense? And so this is an example with kind of 3 different bone images where you're able to look at it and say, are the things that it's classifying as cells or vessels really vessels? And so here, clearly all the things that it classifies as vessels are vessels. But there's this structure here which looks very different from all the other structures. And so being able to look at that and think about it more carefully is important, because you want to be able to say, this makes sense as a vessel, or this is potentially a flaw in the image or our post-processing that we should ignore. Furthermore, down here, when you see this data set, you can see that there's lots and lots of tiny, small little noise artifacts, and these probably aren't vessels. And so if you're counting the number of vessels in your bone, this would probably not be a very good approach. And so that's important for kind of deciding what the boundaries are, but for figuring out what the optimums are, you want to have some sort of quantitative analysis that can do that. So yeah, so this is kind of an example where you do something like a parameter sweep where you take, I know the threshold is somewhere between 2,000 and 8,000, but I'm not sure exactly where it is, because if it's below 2,000, it's looking at the wrong structures. If it's above 8, it's also looking at the wrong structures. And so now you can take a parameter like volume, like anisotropy, or any number of other metrics that you're really interested in, and plot it across this sweep of values, where you can then see how that specific parameter changes as you change your threshold. And so in particular, when you're looking at something like orientation or volume, you can see how that shifts and see how sensitive what you're extracting is to what you've actually set the threshold parameter as. And so ideally, you want something where it's not changing a lot as you change the threshold value. Because if your result is changing quickly when you change the threshold, that means it's very unstable, and it's not necessarily reliable between different samples, because your noise could easily be 10% or something of that value, which means you'll be jumping back and forth on this curve. And so if you pick one point, the values might be different between different measurements. And so we define this kind of quantitatively as the change in the metric over the change in parameter. This isn't very useful. So for any physicist here, this should be quite annoying, because the units of this don't make any sense. If you have something like volume over threshold value, that would be then sort of a change in volume, maybe meter cubed, over Hounsfield units. But the important idea is that sort of how much is your value changing based on how much the value of your parameter is changing. And so you'll want to have some idea of what the normal variation in your image is. And so if you know sort of the noise level is plus or minus 100 or 1,000 units on that scale, and you know that the metric that you're interested in, you need a minimum, or you need the difference between the groups you're looking at is 100 or 200, that you can start to make that sensitivity metric scaled to a more appropriate result so that it means something useful for you. You can also sort of normalize it to the average if you don't have any scale for this, to get some idea of what that means. And so when we look at sort of real measurements, this would be an example of sort of the number of objects you have versus the threshold. And so if you're trying to decide what threshold to use, or which threshold has the most stable or lowest sensitivity, which value would you pick? What? The sides. The middle one. Well, so the lowest isn't necessarily the one. It's the flattest. Because the sensitivity is basically the slope of this line. And so when this line is steep, the sensitivity is very high, which means a small change in your threshold will change the output a lot. And when this is sort of in a valley, the sensitivity is low. And so you want to always be at points where this is as flat as possible, because the steeper it is, the more subject to sort of moving your object count UR. And then often you have, a number of different metrics you're looking at. So you might be looking at anisotropy, count, and volume. And so here's where you plot the sort of sensitivity on a normalized scale, where you can then see as you change this threshold value how the sensitivity percentage changes, and that the minimum sensitivity for something like count might be a higher sensitivity for something like volume and anisotropy. And so this is kind of an unclear problem, because you then have to decide which metric is the most important for you. And so here, the sensitivity for count is the lowest, and probably if you're looking at objects, the count is the most important thing to correctly characterize. Because if you have the wrong count, or you're looking at the wrong objects, then anisotropy and volume are fairly meaningless. And so you would probably focus first on count and then on anisotropy, or then on volume and then on anisotropy in terms of the prioritization. But if you were just looking at sort of how plate-like certain things in your image were, and that was your primary decision criteria for deciding if something worked well or not, then you would probably choose anisotropy as your primary criteria, and you'd want to find the minimum sensitivity for that value. Okay, so I think we'll take a short break here, and then finish with this slides and the other slides after the break. Are there any questions on that so far? Okay, so yeah, you have a break.